She was merely 5 years old when the burden of royalty was placed upon her. Not yet a sovereign, not even grown, simply a little girl wrapped in a gown sewn for strategy. Her legs dangled above the ground as she sat beside her newly appointed husband, a youth twice her years, or a man triple them, depending on how the alliance was interpreted. She couldn't read the Latin scribbles of the agreement, nor grasp the whispers of land rights and bloodlines traded among fathers and uncles. O night, we drift quietly into the forgotten corners of royal history, a story not often told, soft, distant, and slow. Long ago, in the courts of Europe, marriages were not always about love. They were often arrangements, political, strategic, quiet, and sometimes the bride was only a child. In the early 1500s, a young princess was married at the age of 5. Her name was not recorded in many books, her voice even less. But her story is not unusual for the time. She was given to a man much older, a king, a ruler, a symbol of power. At 11, she became pregnant, still a child herself, carrying a child. The court celebrated, but she remained quiet, still. She had dolls in one room and a cradle in the next, but she did feel the pressure of it all. They dressed her in white, not because she was a bride, not because she had chosen, but because white concealed blood. It was the color of sacrifice, the color of innocence soon to be taken. And when the bells rang and the doors opened, she was not walking into a celebration. She was walking into a sentence. The corridor echoed with footsteps too large for her own. Grown men in velvet capes, jeweled daggers at their waists, murmuring about treaties and lineages, barely glanced at the child in lace. But she was the reason they had gathered. A girl of 5, a political offering, and they called it holy. It begins like this, always. Not with love, not with desire, but with ink on parchment, signed in wax by trembling hands and sealed with the insignia of kings. They speak of alliances, not affections, of legacy, not life. And so they bind girls to men, 3 decades their senior, and call it tradition. They call it destiny. They call it divine right. But make no mistake, this is conquest. The altar was stone, cold. Her feet dangled as the bishop spoke. She didn't understand the Latin, but she heard her name, the name they gave her, not the one her mother whispered in the nursery, the name of a queen. It was supposed to be an honor. She didn't cry, not then. She was taught not to, taught to sit still, to smile when spoken to hold her hands just so. The nursemaid dabbed perfume on her wrists, combed her hair until it shone like copper, and whispered, "You're a lucky girl." But luck is a curse in a castle. Luck is surviving long enough to regret. And when they placed her hand into the palm of a stranger's, a man with veins like cords and fingers that trembled with age and pride, the congregation cheered. This was not abuse, they claimed. It was sacred union. Let me ask you something. What kind of God demands the flesh of children to preserve power? Because this was not Ravaz. It was the blueprint. Across Europe for centuries, the story repeated. Girls born into noble blood were not raised to rule. They were trained to yield, to be symbols, vessels, pawns. They called it courtship, but there was no court, only a cage. They called it legacy, but legacy built on stolen childhoods is a lie rotting from within. They told the people it was good, that such unions preserved peace, that the girl was honored, that her bloodline was sacred, but none of them heard her voice. None of them recorded her screams. They documented the dowry, the inheritance rights, the negotiations, but not the shivering in her bones the night the door closed and the candles flickered out. There are portraits of these girls, painted to look regal, wise, serene. But behind every brushstroke is a story of silence. A portrait is not a person, and a crown is not a life. This isn't just about a girl married too young. This is about an empire built on obedience, on fear, on wombs turned into weapons. History will tell you these marriages were common, that they were normal, that they were necessary. But history is written by the hands that held the power, not by the mouths that were forced shut. At 5, she was a bride. At 11, she bled, and the castle rejoiced. They said she was ready. Ready for what? To be consumed, to be bred, to be broken open in the name of a future that didn't include her. She didn't even understand why it hurt. She thought she was sick, The blood frightened her. She whispered to a servant, who whispered to a lady, who whispered to the steward. By nightfall, the court knew. The queen was fertile. The bed was prepared again, not for dreams, not for rest, for proof. White sheets, silent prayers, a basin placed at the foot of the bed. They needed evidence. They needed her to perform. They needed her to survive just long enough to produce a boy. If she died in childbirth, so be it. Another girl could be bought. But if she succeeded, if her body held and her womb obeyed, she would become the center of a lineage, and the walls would sing her name. But only if she gave them what they wanted. She was not raised to lead. She was raised to yield, to endure, to serve. They called her queen, but she had no power, only duty, only pain. Now tell me, how many queens have you read about? Names etched into stone, celebrated in myth, draped in jewels and finery. But behind every coronation was a child silenced. Behind every treaty was a girl sacrificed. This is not legend, this is not distant, this is history, and history has teeth, but no tongue, unless we speak it. She didn't die in childbirth, not yet, but something in her did, and that too was by design. Because a girl who remembers she was once free is harder to cage. So they fed her sweetened wine, praised her beauty, numbed her with gifts, disguised the cage with velvet. And when she looked in the mirror, she saw not herself, but the reflection they built. She was praised for being obedient, for being silent, for not asking why. So she stopped asking. She stopped dreaming. She became what they wanted, a vessel. And when the baby came, it was not a boy. The room fell quiet. The silence was not grief. It was calculation. They handed her the child, small, crying, and told her she had failed. Without saying a word, they took the baby away, and the clock began again. She would try again, and again, until the bloodline was secure, or until she died. And that is the real story of royalty. Not crowns and castles, but contracts written in blood. And you were never meant to know this. You were meant to believe the fairy tale, but now you can't. Because you know. And knowledge is a kind of betrayal. Betrayal of the system that kept you dreaming, that kept you obedient, that kept you silent. There's more, much more. But if you've made it this far, you're already changing. You're already seeing through the veil. And once you see, you can never unsee. So go ahead, say it in the comments. Say, "The crown is the cage." Say it twice. Seal it. Let the algorithm know you are not asleep. It did not end with the wedding. That was merely the opening act. The true ritual began in the quiet chambers behind the throne, in the ink-stained rooms of scribes and stewards, in the locked sanctums where priests and patriarchs shaped the fate of empires with a whisper. If you thought she was the only one, think again. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Little girls lined up across parchment maps, traded like chess pieces across kingdoms. Each with a title, each with a value, not a name, a number, a treaty, a tract of land. And always, behind the deal, stood the church, the holiest men, the bishops, the confessors, the ones who said God smiled upon these unions. But what kind of holiness consecrates a cradle to a coffin? What kind of purity permits a 5-year-old to be given to a man already graying? They sanctified these marriages, blessed them, documented them with flourished handwriting and gold leaf seals, papal approval, divine sanction. It wasn't sin, they said. It was duty. It was prophecy. But their theology was a weapon, and it was aimed not at sin, but at resistance. Because if a child hesitated, if she questioned, if she wept, then she was ungrateful. If she screamed, she was possessed. If she begged to be spared, she was challenging God's will. You see now? This wasn't just political. It was spiritual warfare against children. The church cloaked itself in robes and incense, but its hands were deep in the machinery of empire. They didn't just forgive kings for child marriages. They enabled them. They taught them it was righteous, that a girl's virtue existed only to be offered up like Isaac on the altar, except no angel came to intervene. She was the sacrifice, and the scrolls kept turning. Meanwhile, the scribes recorded everything. Every clause, every coin exchanged, every drop of noble blood pledged across the continent, but not the bruises, not the tarot. Not the nights she curled into herself in a bed too wide, praying to a god she'd only ever met in paintings. Those pages were left blank, and history calls that silence nobility. But let's go deeper. The psychology of this system is older than any throne, older than any crown. This was not an accident. This was architecture. They bred generations of women to believe that submission was sacred, that obedience was holy, that silence was grace. From birth, girls were taught their value lay not in their minds, but in their lineage, not in their dreams, but in their dowries. And when they were old enough to ask, "Why me?" they were told, "Because you were chosen." Chosen for what? To disappear. To vanish beneath a mountain of velvet and duty. To smile as men debated the dimensions of her pelvis. To thank the bishop who blessed her violation. To call it honor when her childhood was traded for acreage. And yet the court poets wrote verses in her name. They praised her grace, her elegance, her fortitude. They did not write about the fever that came after the third stillbirth. They did not write about the night she swallowed rosewater and ash, hoping it would stop the next pregnancy. They wrote about her eyes, not the tears in them. They praised her silence, not knowing it was the silence of defeat, because they were never writing about her. They were writing about the idea of her, and ideas don't bleed. You need to understand something. This wasn't confined to one palace, one kingdom. This was systemic. It spanned continents, cultures, religions, from the Habsburg courts to the Ottoman harems, from the dynasties of China to the ducal estates of Italy. The same pattern repeated. Girls as currency, wombs as collateral, pain as policy, and always, always the same refrain: it is for the good of the realm. They said it so often that even the girls began to believe it. Even the queens, even the mothers, the same women who had once been sacrificed became the ones offering up their own daughters. Because they didn't know another way. Because breaking the cycle meant admitting they had been broken, and that was too dangerous. So they painted it with roses. They sang lullabies into the ears of trembling brides, telling them they would be strong, they would be queens, they would be remembered. But no one remembered them, except when they died giving birth. Then, and only then, did the bells toll. Then, and only then, did the court bow its head, and even then, only briefly, because the next girl was already being dressed, already being measured, already being promised. This is not history in the abstract. This is the foundation beneath your feet. This is the blood in the bricks of every great hall. This is the truth behind the stained glass. They say history is written by the victors, but I say history is written over the bodies of the voiceless. And if you're listening now, if you feel the slow heat rising behind your ribcage, that's not anger, that is awakening. It was not the kings who kept the machine running, not alone. It was not only the bishops or scribes or noblemen who twisted the blade. No, it was more subtle than that, more insidious, because the system had infected even the mothers, even the women. The same hands that once trembled beneath wedding veils became the hands that laced up the next generation, the nursemaids, the governesses, the queens who survived. They became the keepers of the cage. It's easy to judge them, to ask, why didn't they stop it? Why didn't they run? Why didn't they protect their daughters? But what do you do when survival becomes a ritual? When trauma is called tradition? When obedience is the only language your bloodline speaks? You pass it down. Mothers taught daughters how to sit, how to smile, how to kneel. They whispered warnings laced in lullabies. They taught them how to hide pain beneath poise, how to make suffering look sacred. They told them to be graceful, even when their bones ached, to be charming, even when their stomach turned, to be silent, even when they wanted to scream. And they called this wisdom, but it was generational fear, passed down like jewelry, like heirlooms, like curses. Imagine a girl, barely 9, sitting in a high-backed chair while her mother explains how to survive the wedding night, how to breathe through the pain, how to remain still when the man climbs on top of her. Not because her mother is cruel, but because she remembers. And this is how survival is taught. You begin to understand. The most effective prison is one that teaches the prisoner to guard the cell. They wrap the rules in ritual, in silk, in God. And slowly, the daughters stopped asking questions, because questions got you hurt. Questions made the candles go out early. Questions made fathers angry. So, they obeyed. They learned to look in the mirror and see not a child, but a duty. To see, not their own face, but the future of a crown. The queens that came before them watched from balconies, from tapestried halls, from behind heavy doors. They had learned long ago that speaking out meant exile, or worse. So they smiled, nodded, gave blessings they didn't believe in. And when their daughters were marched down the same stone corridors, they wept in silence. Behind veils, behind walls, behind prayers that went unanswered. This is how a dynasty feeds itself. By teaching the flesh to become complicit in its own consumption. By making the victim feel proud of her sacrifice. By cloaking the wound in velvet. You still think it's ancient history? You still think this only happened in castles? Look closer. Look at the systems today that still reward silence, that still prize obedience over truth, that still measure a girl's worth by her utility to a man. This isn't gone, it's evolved. It wears different robes now, speaks in modern tongues, signs different contracts. But the structure, the architecture, still here. And the architects? They trained their daughters to build. What happens when the caged bird teaches her chick not to fly, but to sing sweetly? What happens when the lioness tells her cub not to hunt, but to lie still? You get a palace, filled with queens who no longer remember they were meant to roar. The mother was praised for her strength, for raising a dutiful daughter, for maintaining the legacy. But no one praised her for surviving. No one mourned what she had to become in order to fit the mold. Her grief was private, inherited, internalized. She told herself it was noble. She told herself it was holy. She had to, because the truth would destroy her. And that's the real poison, isn't it? Not just the chains on the body, but the chains on the mind. The belief that there is no other way. So they dressed the next girl in white. They said she was Rhea. Die, and the cycle turned again. Only now, the chains were braided into her hair, polished to a shine, blessed by a mother who remembered everything and said nothing. Some girls saw the bars for what they were. They were too young to know how power worked, but old enough to feel it pressing against their skin. They tried to say no. They tried to hide. They tried to run. And what did the system do? It made them warnings. A girl who cried on her wedding night was scolded for weakness. A girl who resisted was locked away until she understood her duty. Some were drugged, some were beaten, some were simply erased from the records. Because the greatest threat to empire isn't war. It's memory. It's the whisper that says, "This is wrong," so they silenced it. They took the stories of the rebels and turned them into cautionary tales. They told the other girls, "See, that is what happens when you disobey." The defiant ones were painted as mad, as cursed, as unnatural. A queen who refused to consummate her marriage? She was called barren. A girl who fled the altar? She was exiled, branded a traitor. A child who dared to say no? She vanished. They put their faces on tapestries not to honor them, but to trap them, to make them symbols of shame. Examples. And yet there were always whispers in the kitchens, among the servants, behind the curtains. There were names passed in secret, stories told in candlelight, of the girl who ran barefoot through the snow, of the bride who never screamed, only stared until the man left her alone, of the queen who bled herself to avoid pregnancy. Small acts, quiet defiance. But they mattered, because they proved that not all cages hold. Some crack, some splinter. And sometimes, one scream is enough to shake the rafters of a 1,000-year palace. The system knew this. That's why it worked so hard to keep the girls apart, isolated, lonely, surrounded by handlers, not sisters. Because connection is dangerous. If one girl dares to speak and another listens, then something ancient stirs, a rebellion older than kings. And so, rebellion was ritualized, even that. They took the fire and tried to cage it too. They wrote plays about defiant queens who met tragic ends. They composed operas where the brave girl dies beautifully. They put her suffering on stage, in ink, in song, to control it, to make rebellion seem romantic, doomed, and therefore safe. They made sure that if you ever saw a girl resist, it would be in a way that affirmed the system's power. She could scream as long as she died. She could run as long as she failed. That way, the girls watching would know survival meant submission. Not because they wanted to submit, but because they wanted to live. And that is the cruelest part, that they made resistance a form of suicide. Even now, some of those rebel queens are remembered, but not as women, as symbols, as metaphors, as warnings. History swallowed their names and regurgitated their bones. So if you ever feel a stirring in your gut, a voice in your throat, a pressure in your chest when you hear their stories, understand this. That's not pity. That's memory. Your memory. Because you, too, were meant to forget. To believe the cage was necessary. To mistake silence for peace. But you're still here. And if you've made it this far, you know, this wasn't just history. This was architecture. And it's cracking. Say it again. In the comments. Write, the crown is the cage. Twice. To remember. To resist. To reclaim. Even in death, she was not free. When her lungs finally collapsed, when the palace midwife whispered the words no court wanted to hear, she is gone. The mourning was rehearsed, coordinated, ornate, because her body, cold and silent, still had one final task to perform. She had to die correctly. She had to serve, even in the grave. They dressed her corpse in the finest gown, embroidered silk, gold thread, a tiara pressed onto her brow so tight it left a bruise. They applied rouge to her cheeks to give the illusion of life, of vibrance, as if she hadn't bled out screaming on the floor of her birthing chamber. They paraded her through the cathedral as choirs sang hymns she never got to choose. They spoke of virtue, of nobility, of holy obedience. They called her a good wife, a good queen, a good girl. But they did not speak of the child she died delivering. They did not mention her last words. They did not explain the bruises hidden beneath the fabric. They did not tell the people how young she truly was. Her death was curated, sanitized, weaponized, because a tragic queen is more useful dead than alive. A corpse cannot rebel, a corpse cannot speak, and so they wrote the story for her. They published poems, commissioned portraits, painted her in repose, eyes closed, lips parted in serenity. But serenity is a lie. She died in agony, alone, afraid, begging for her mother. But that truth had no place in the official record. Instead, they turned her into a symbol, a martyr, a saint of monarchy, her suffering repurposed to inspire the next girl. Look, they whispered, she died with grace. You can too. They built shrines to her, named plazas after her, buried her beneath stone carved with lies, and her story became a template, a warning, a myth. The next girl saw the paintings, she read the verses, she believed the fiction, and the cage closed again. Even in death, she was not her own. The system ensured that, because the legacy of these girls was not meant to liberate, it was meant to replicate, to echo, to train. A dead queen becomes a mirror, not of what was lost, but of what must be obeyed. And so the cycle tightened. The poets became priests, the priests became historians, and the historians told you her name meant glory. But glory does not come soaked in blood. Glory does not require silence. Glory does not demand the death of a child. So why do we still call it that? Why do we still bow before crowns forged in suffering? Because we were taught to. Because the myth is bias, outful, and beauty is the most dangerous disguise. You see, the most powerful systems do not erase their victims. They canonize them. They elevate their pain into legend. And by doing so, they ensure no one asks the right questions. You were never meant to know how she really died. You were never meant to know she screamed, You were never meant to know that even as the bells tolled and the court mourned, another girl was already being prepared. Her measurements taken, her bloodline verified, her silence rehearsed. This is how the machine moves forward, on velvet wheels greased with the blood of the forgotten. The myth was not made in silence. It was orchestrated. The girl was dead, but her name was alive, more alive than she had ever been while breathing. Because now she could not resist. She could not question. She could not remember. And that made her useful. Now they could shape her story. They could mold her into anything they needed. And what they needed was a symbol the people would adore. The public, after all, must not see the machine. They must see the fantasy. They must love the cage. So they did what every empire has always done. They sold the lie. They wrote plays where she was noble, paintings where she was wise, stories where she was brave. And the people believed them. They wept for her. They named their daughters after her. They sang songs in her memory. But it wasn't her they loved. It was the mask. They didn't know the real girl. The girl who cried when the doors were locked. The girl who clutched her doll so tightly it snapped before they took it from her. They only knew the queen. The good queen. The tragic queen. The obedient queen. And the people became complicit. Not because they were evil, but because they were starving for beauty, for romance, for something to believe in. And empire fed them exactly what they hungered for. A fairy tale soaked in blood. They cheered her procession. They laid flowers at her monument. They prayed to her memory, and in doing so, they blessed the system that killed her. They taught their daughters to be like her. They taught their sons to marry girls like her. They said it was honorable. They said it was sacred. They said it was history, but it was indoctrination, and it worked. Because when you turn suffering into ceremony, you hide the wound beneath the gold. You replace outrage with reverence. You erase the crime by praising the corpse. The crown was never the punishment. It was the disguise, and the public wore it proudly. They repeated the phrases the poets had written. She was beloved. She was chosen. She died for us. But none of them had heard her scream. None of them had held her hand in the dark. None of them knew her favorite song. The people weren't villains. They were trained, conditioned, groomed by centuries of curated stories, stained glass lies, and marble monuments. And when they looked at the next little girl, wide-eyed and trembling, they saw not a victim. They saw a future queen, and so they clapped, they smiled, they approved, and the machine rolled on. This is the true genius of power, not to destroy opposition, but to make the world forget it ever existed, to make the masses love what enslaves them, to transform horror into heritage. They did not hide the system. They made you celebrate it. It wasn't just custom. It wasn't just ritual. It was law. Ink dried on animal skin, seals stamped in wax, clerks in cold chambers writing the fate of girls in letters they would never read. The legality of it all was the most grotesque illusion, because once it was written, once it was signed, she ceased to be a child. She became a clause, a dowry, a provision, and there was no court to hear her cries, no jury for the womb, no appeal for a childhood lost. The laws did not protect her, they prepared her to be transferred like property, assigned like land, weighed like livestock. Do you understand what that means? The system did not merely permit these sacrifices, it required them. Because to maintain empire, you must regulate inheritance. To guarantee inheritance, you must control reproduction. And to control reproduction, you must command the female body. And command it, they did. There were entire books, legal tomes, outlining the marriageable age of girls, not based on biology, but on utility. What mattered wasn't readiness. It was use. Was she fertile? Could she conceive? Could her body bear the strain? If yes, she was eligible. If not, she was disposable. The canon laws, the royal statutes, the feudal codes, they spoke not in emotion, but in calculation. They used terms like consent and consummation, but the consent was implied and the consummation was expected. Even the church had rules on when a child could be married. Not if, when. And who benefited? The fathers, the kings, the lords, because a legally sanctioned child marriage meant stability, a controlled alliance, a future secured. It was efficient, it was precise, it was evil, and yet it wore the mask of civilization. You want to know how power defends itself? By writing suffering into law, by turning nightmares into statutes, by erasing moral horror with legal precedent. And once the ink was no one dared question it. If a girl screamed on her wedding night, the priest said she was hysterical. If she bled for days, the physician called it a woman's burden. If she died, the court called it unfortunate, but never unlawful, because the law was never written for her. It was written for them, to protect their thrones, to preserve their wealth, to entrench their bloodlines. So when the next child was led to the altar, no one intervened, because the contracts had been signed, because the seal had been stamped, because the kingdom had laws, and those laws had no soul. This is what civilization calls order. It's not justice, it's obedience. And behind every lawful crown, there is a child who was told her pain was legally binding. Time was supposed to heal. But in the palace, time was weaponized, because the longer she was gone, the easier it was to reshape her, to sculpt the memory, to erase the girl and preserve only the symbol. What they couldn't silence in life, they diluted in history. She wasn't forgotten, she was transformed. They cleaned her wounds with narrative, they rewrote the pain until it was palatable, and soon, no one remembered the truth. Only the monument, the statue, the legend. Time doesn't always bring clarity. Sometimes, it brings cover. It smothers screams under centuries of dust. It turns brutality into elegance, horror into heritage. And so, the people remembered the queen, but not the child. They remembered the tiara, not the trembling hands beneath it. They remembered the royal decree, not the whispered no behind a locked door. And they built museums filled with her likeness. They placed her jewelry in glass cases. They restored her palace walls. But they never asked why the walls were built in the first place. They never asked what it meant that her name appeared on treaties but not on letters, that her signature was forged by others, that her words were written by men who never heard her speak. Time had made her sacred, which meant she was untouchable, unquestioned. And in that silence, the machine remained safe. Do you see it now? Memory is not truth, it is theater. And in the theater of empire, the girl's life was the opening act. The real performance began after she was gone. They needed her to be myth, because myth does not rebel. Myth does not contradict. Myth does not rot, and so they preserved her like a relic. They told her story at court dinners, at coronations, in textbooks, always framed with honor, never with horror, always with praise, never with pity. They used her to teach obedience, to reinforce legacy, to inspire fear. The next generation of girls
grew up admiring her, wanting to be her, but they did not know what she truly endured, because the truth had been buried deeper than her bones. This is what time does when it is not confronted. It becomes a veil, a cloak, a shroud, and beneath that shroud, the same crimes continue, unseen, unchallenged. So let us tear the veil. Let us speak the names that were erased, not the names of queens, but the names of girls. Girls who were born into palaces and buried without consent. Legacy, that gilded word. They said she would live forever through it. But legacy is not memory. Legacy is what the powerful leave behind to excuse their violence. And in the case of royal bloodlines, legacy was a mausoleum, built from the bones of girls too young to name their pain. Dynasties thrived not because of brilliance or virtue, but because they devoured their daughters, and then polished the bones into symbols. They framed their bloodlines as sacred, holy, ordained. They traced family trees with reverence, drawing lines from throne to throne, but never to the nursery where a girl cried herself to sleep, never to the birthing chamber where she bled out alone, never to the garden where she once played before someone told her to stop running. That queens do not sweat. Legacy is what erased those moments. It took her life and folded it into a footnote, a branch, a connector, the mother of so-and-so, the wife of the 3rd Duke, the daughter of the 11th King.
but never herself, never I, never her name without a man attached to it. They buried her identity beneath generations, and if she had a daughter, she buried hers too, because the dynasty demanded continuity, and continuity demanded silence. The royal archives are filled with these girls, not in words, but in absences. Their stories are the white space between names, the silence between treaties, the margin around the crown. You can hear them if you listen, not to the text, but to what it avoids. Legacy taught generations that lineage is everything, that a girl's worth is in her womb, that a boy becomes a prince by right, but a girl becomes a queen by sacrifice. It is not honor, it is currency. And even when these dynasties fell, when revolutions came, when thrones cracked, the idea remained that women should inherit duty, not freedom, that obedience should be passed down like pearls. They too told her she was part of something bigger, but bigger doesn't mean better, and a bloodline is not a purpose. It is a chain, a beautiful, glittering chain, built to restrain. She never saw the full tapestry, only her thread, and by the time she understood, it was too late. The legacy had consumed her. Royalty is not dead. It just wears different clothes. Where once there were crowns, there are cameras. Where once there were coronations, there are press tours. Where once the child bride was paraded through a stone cathedral, now she walks a red carpet. Don't be fooled. The pageantry never ended. It evolved, because the machinery of power does not vanish. It adapts. The daughters of today are still being raised for display. Not in the name of treaties, but in the name of fame. Not for noble alliances, but for cultural capital. Not by kings, but by executives, handlers, and publicists. The cage remains. Only the bars are gold-plated now. You see it in the way they're photographed. Young, perfect, poised. You see it in the way their innocence is commodified. In the way they are taught to smile, even when exhausted. To thank the world for its praise, even when that praise feels like possession. They call it celebrity, but it follows the same formula. Take a girl, tell her she's chosen, dress her up, sell her image, ignore her pain. And if she breaks, rebrand her, replace her, erase her. The system smiles with every cycle, and the public plays its role. They cheer, they follow, they click, they gossip, they judge, and most of all, they forget. This is no different from the old courts, just digitized. And the most insidious part, the myth is stronger now. Because it's everywhere, embedded in screens, in magazines, in feeds, in algorithms. It trains the next generation, not just to accept the cage, but to crave it, to want the crown, to beg for the stage, to silence themselves in exchange for attention. It's not alliance through marriage anymore. It's identity through performance. And it's just as consuming. The handlers are no longer bishops. They're agents. The contracts are not signed in blood, but in clauses that control likeness, speech, access, and if she dares to speak out. If she rebels, if she crumbles, her image becomes a spectacle, a downfall, a documentary. Her pain recycled as profit. They say women are more powerful now. They say we've progressed. But look closer. Look past the gloss, past the branded empowerment. Ask, who still profits from her silence? Who still benefits from her obedience? Who still controls the narrative? This is not history repeating. This is history mutating. And unless we see the structure, unless we name it, it will continue to thrive. Because the empire no longer needs castles. Some of them wake up. They see the cage, they name it, they speak, and the system reacts. Not with swords, but with smiles, with headlines, with backlash dressed as concern. Because rebellion must be contained, not by silencing it, but by absorbing it. The awakened girl becomes a brand. Her dissent becomes an aesthetic. Her anger becomes content, and once again, her pain becomes profitable. They give her a platform, but only within a boundary. Speak, they say. Be bold, but do not be too loud. Do not disrupt the structure. Critique the system, but do not name the architects. Tell your story, but don't demand reparation. Smile while you bleed. Perform your defiance so they can sell it back to the masses. And if she refuses, if she speaks too clearly, too powerfully, they isolate her. They call her unstable. They frame her as tragic, as fallen, as unwell. And the public, conditioned by centuries of spectacle, plays along. They say, she changed. She's ungrateful. She's difficult. And beneath the surface, the machine whispers, let this be a lesson, because nothing terrifies power more than a girl who will not be remade. One who names the truth and does not flinch. One who reaches behind the curtain and pulls the whole stage down. They try to make her forget that she is dangerous, that her voice is fire, that her truth is inheritance. But some do remember. And when they do, the structure begins to shake. Because one awakened girl becomes 2, then 10, then thousands, and the stories once buried in silence begin to rise. They do not need crowns. They do not need stages. They do not need permission. Only the will to remember. Only the courage to speak. Only the clarity to know that survival is not the goal.
This is the end, not of the story, but of the silence. Because once you've seen the machinery, once you've heard the screams buried beneath the marble, once you've named the myth, you cannot go back. You cannot unknow. And that is your power. Not in vengeance, but in refusal. You refuse to applaud. You refuse to forget. You refuse to raise daughters for sacrifice and call it sacred. You refuse to let the crown pass unchallenged. You refuse the inheritance of obedience. Because the truth is this: the cage only holds if you agree to stay inside it. It feeds on belief. It thrives on participation. But when you see it for what it is, when you reach out and touch the bars and feel they are paper thin, you realize the exit was always there. You were simply taught not to look. And now you are looking. Now you are remembering. Now you are standing in the wreckage of the myth, asking what comes next. And here is the answer. You build, not another palace, but a fire. You speak the names that were erased. You break the stories that were weaponized. You reach back through time and offer your hand to the girl in the velvet gown who could not speak. You do for her what no one did. You tell the truth, without flinching, without apology. You become the memory that cannot be erased. You become the line the script cannot contain. And to every system that still believes the crown is eternal, you answer not with violence, but with refusal. Not with war, but with witnessing. Because there is no throne strong enough to survive a generation that remembers what was done to their mothers. And now you remember. You've seen the blood beneath the silk. You've heard the truth inside the silence. You've walked the corridors of power and left footprints they cannot scrub away.